Leeds! What is happening? Welcome to Working Hours, a show about a place called Leeds, a time called now, and an activity called work. Working Hours wants to record 1,000 loiners over the course of this, the most important decade in the history of the human species, and ask them about what they do all day and hear how they feel about it. My mission is to try to map out what my city, Leeds, a city that has declared a climate emergency, is doing during humanity's biggest emergency. On Working Hours, we hear how loiners have, are, and will be coping with our multiple crises: the global pandemic, Brexit, and of course, the ongoing and accelerating collapsing of capitalism, the state, and the climate through this decade. To do this, I need people like you, dear listener. Most of all, I need people who are in Leeds or who are from Leeds to come on this show and be my guests. So please join me and help me with this mission whenever and however you can. Critically, I will need people like you, dear listener, as financial backers. Please consider supporting or donating to this project. You can do so with a £1 monthly donation via either Patreon or Ko-fi, or you could donate any one-off amount to Working Hours via either Ko-fi or through the LibrePay button on the About page of Western Studios' website. Thank you. My name is Simon, and this is all my fault. What did you want to be when you grew up?
I don't think I had a very clear idea at all what I wanted to be when I grew up. No, I don't think. I think that was just more a matter of life chances which steered me in the path that I eventually took.
You're listening to Series 3, Episode 32, and to my guest, Ron Wiener. This is another Zoom interview recorded on the 24th of August 2022. Hello, loves. Ron Wiener, or Wiener, I didn't check the pronunciation, so apologies to Ron, is a semi-retired community theatre director, socio-dramatist, and grandparent. Born in London, brought up in Australia, Ron has lived in England for the past 67 years and in Leeds since 1975. He has worked all over the world as a socio-dramatist. Ron is a founder member of ISCAN, the International Socio-drama and Action Methods Network, which runs courses on Zoom and on live, covering topics such as global warming, ageing, team building, facilitating organisational change, and much more. Ron is a member of 2 local community psychology groups and writes academic articles. He also runs an online Zoom improvisation group and directs at an Asian theatre company, Chai Cup. You can find out more about Ron at ronwiener.co.uk. That's www.Romeo Oscar November Whiskey India Echo November Echo Romeo.co.uk. Now, please enjoy this episode of Working Hours with Ron Wiener. So, what is it that you ended up doing then?
Well, a whole variety of different things at different stages of my life. As I'm quite old now, my life's passed through lots of different stages. I think the first job I ever had after leaving university in Sydney, Australia, was working in Hobart for the Australian government as a careers officer, which always struck me as being really odd when I was 21 with no life experience at all. I actually meant to be advising young people on what they should do. I mean, my main major at university then was psychology. I then came over to England and I hitchhiked around Europe for a bit and then had enough of that. And so I got a job at something that's no longer exists called the National Institute of Industrial Psychology. Decided that didn't take me very far and that a past degree from an Australian university wasn't a good stepping stone. So I thought I'd go back into academia for a bit. Tried a number of universities, including, I think one in Wales, which said they didn't recognise my Australian degree at all, and I'd have to start again as an undergraduate. But luckily, the LSE took a punt on me, and I then did a PhD in social psychology, and my dissertation was on drug taking among school children, and that led to a book, and then led me doing some consultancy work with the World Health Organization and working with Rotterdam City Council. And then I'd done postgraduate work at the LSE doing conflict research. So myself and a colleague, at the time there was all the conflict going on in Northern Ireland, and we went and set up the Northern Ireland Research Institute. And I worked there primarily as a community planner for over 3 or 4 years. That led to another book. Then and that was in the worst time of the Troubles. So there was a lot of adventures, if you might like to say. Then I came back to England and got a job that's when I came to Leeds in 1975, which was the year I remember because it's the year my daughter was born. And I got a job at the adult education department at the University of Leeds. So I was doing basically community education, community development work. That finished, then I got it. And then I moved now I got a job at Bradford University, setting up a community development department and lecturing in community psychology. I got tired of being an academic and went and then ran a psychiatric day centre in Leeds. That led on to training in something called a socio-dramatist. And I did that. Then I became a freelance training consultant working with social services departments, voluntary sector organisations, or a variety of different organisations, and developed my career as a socio-dramatist, which led to running workshops across most of the world. Then I came back and decided that I needed to do something which I could continue to do as I aged. So I became a community theatre director and ran different community theatre groups. I still work as a socio-dramatist. I still work as a community theatre director. And that's where I am. And so obviously I'm now part-time rather than full-time.
I don't know. It seems like all the sexy and glamorous stuff were kind of before you hit Leeds. I mean, would you agree with that?
No, I think there were good adventures beforehand, and also very interesting projects since I came to Leeds. I mean, when I was in Bradford, I worked with community groups there, and we set up a project called the Bradford Musical, which lasted for about 3 years. We was trying to bring together as many different groups into a mass event that eventually ran out of money and steam. But the idea stayed in my head. And when we came to Leeds, when the arena opened, I worked with a couple of groups, had an idea about bringing all as many choirs as we could together in Leeds to develop a story about a wedding. And that we would then take the final bit of it after the singing bit down to the playhouse, do the wedding there. And then we would finish with a mass event in closing Brigadoff, where all the different cultural organisations in Leeds could have stalls, and that would be the wedding celebration. So we went to the arena with this idea. We thought this was a great idea. It helped to establish the arena as part of the community of Leeds. And then we said, how much would that cost in terms of just to try out thing in money terms if we wanted to hire for a couple of days? And they said, well, if we put it at our most basic rates, that's £40,000 a night. So that killed that particular project.
So, yeah, I think there's a couple of things that I want to look at initially. So your kind of journey from doing analysis and, academic work and psychiatric work, psychological work into doing drama. And then the other thing that I'd like to sort of explore a little bit is, obviously you're working in a field. I mean, there's been a lot of changes in that field, and you're not like in the early days of it, but you are into a point where, like, I would say all of those ideas are much more accepted and widespread now, So sort of it'd be nice to look at, what you see as the changes and sort of how your work has developed, I suppose, but also how the the sector's developed, because you're starting a lot of things, and a lot of that seems to be quite, or like maybe higher end, more cutting edge stuff that you're kind of doing. Like, it doesn't sound like there is a lot of the programs that you've mentioned happening at those times. It seems more like you're doing, especially because you're in academia. So I'm like making assumptions here. But if you could talk about those two elements for a bit.
I think what's interesting, I've been looking back at some of the writing I did when I was running a psychiatric day centre in Leeds. This was in late 1970s, early 1980s. And I wrote a bit about community psychology then. And I found the article I wrote some recently, and in 1976, I think, and I took it into some academics at the university, and they said, God, this is really relevant. Part of it was about issues to do with mental health. Part of it was to do with, back in the mid-1970s, there was a huge amount of industrial strife, trade union conflict, issues around community development. There were poverties, there were strikes. And so
stagflation.
Yeah. So what was interesting was how reminiscent the present situation is a lot of the stuff that was happening 40 years ago. And I think part of the interesting thing in some ways is how almost like each generation, it's very difficult talking to people often about stuff you did 30 or 40 years ago, campaigns you were actually involved in. And that's sort of seen as old history and not relevant, whereas actually many of the things that are happening now have their precedents in things that happened there and no lessons to be learned. So, for example, at the moment, one of the things behind the climate change thing is to get and also the don't pay campaigns that are around at the moment, are about people not paying or getting arrested and things like that.
Non-compliance.
Non-compliance in order to bring the system to a halt. But if you go back to things like the Committee of 100 and protests about CMD, scores of years ago, 40, 50 years ago, they were doing exactly the same campaign thing on the idea that if enough people protested, and so there becomes things like magical numbers, that you have to get enough people on side to protest. Otherwise, the state just picks off individuals along the way. So there's lessons to be learned. Why didn't campaigns earlier on work, or what parts of them worked, what parts of them didn't work? What are the lessons that you could bring forward now? So how do you get enough people? And so there's this magical number that's talked about as 3.5%. If you get 3.5% of the population to engage in some sort of protest.
Yeah, that's the tipping point. Yeah.
That becomes the tipping point. So how does XR or these other campaigns actually marshal the 3.5% in order to be able to do something? And then, of course, it raises a whole lot of other issues, because even if you get the sufficient number and it begins overwhelming, if you like, the state in some way, the existing forces, what are the new structures that are going to be in place, which ensure that the old system doesn't immediately rock back into place again? Because then you can begin looking at things like the Arab Spring, what happened in Sri Lanka recently, where you had the mass of people and the protests actually happening, people temporarily taking power, then the state came back into power again. So there's that sense of what is it that we learn from history that we can take forward into the present.
I mean, I think a lot of people are kind of like, why isn't there more protest, and why isn't there more, why isn't there more militancy or more organization around this, that, and the other? I think a lot of it is, we do pay attention to history to a degree. And a lot of people are kind of like, well, that doesn't work, or that doesn't work. So it's like, is it really worth going out and getting, beaten by the police or stamped on by the police for something that might not necessarily win anyway? And then if you do win, then it's that problem, like you say, of so you take power. Now, what do you do with it? How do you wield it now? Yeah.
Many years ago, I ran a WEA class, which was actually taking that particular point where we said, if you're the Revolutionary Committee and you've taken charge of Leeds, let's explore what you would do and how it would actually work. What would be different? So in a sense, and a lot of the training a lot of the work I do as a socio-dramatist is actually creating, if you like, dramatic situations which enable people to explore what's going on in a particular group or a particular topic like global warming, and to be able to try to understand it from as many viewpoints as possible. And then to begin looking where in the system you can actually find a way of beginning to push for change.
Yeah, it's sort of, I suppose, like looking for weakness in a chain, but also looking for the strength of like what's the cohesive stuff, what's holding everything together, and what's the points that you can triangulate on, and how can you leverage this, or how could you work in there? So sort of creating that mental map for people. Yeah. So you're working on a lot of funded stuff. You're traveling around. You're based in London. You're at the LSE, which must have, it's a good place for contacts and networking, isn't it? The LSE. And you sort of centre there in London. You're working out in Northern Ireland. Like, you're involved in a lot of stuff. Did that all just come from the book? Because you sort of said that you published the book, and then it seemed like
the first book I published was about my PhD on drug taking. So that, in a sense, had a very narrow focus in terms of if you like, basically the drug education field. Going over and working in Northern Ireland was entirely different, and it was interesting because it's probably one of the few times in this country where temporarily there's been an armed working class. So that was very interesting in terms of the community action that actually took place. The power balances, if you like, between the community groups with the paramilitary organizations and the state was the community groups at that time, for a brief period of time, had a lot of power. I mean, I can remember one time being with community activists, and we were trying to stop some redevelopment taking place because we didn't like the plans that were going through, which were all about high-rise blocks and getting rid of ribbon road shopping. And the government minister or one of the officials sitting at the desk opposite us would say, well, we're going to send the bulldozers in on Monday. And one of the people sitting next to me and said, they're likely to be shot if they come. And so there were, again, it didn't last long, but it was very interesting where if you like, the power balance between the state and the working class was temporarily in a much more fluid state than it normally is.
I mean, that's a good answer to that sort of, we're going to do this development, we're sending the bulldozers in. Oh, no, you won't, we'll shoot them, is kind of, it's pretty final. But normally it works the other way, doesn't it? Of like, we're just sending the bulldozers in.
Yes, exactly.
What are you going to do?
Yeah, one of the things you learn is that very rarely, in nearly all cases where there's community participation, if you like, the state already knows the answer that it wants. And
it's just trying to get you to say yes to it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, we've come to ask you, even though we've decided already what we're doing, but we feel like we should pretend you have a voice. So what do you want to do? Okay, we won't do that. So let's go into then, let's stay a bit more on sort of the changes you've seen within the industry. So obviously academic work is largely, you're in books, you're doing research, or you're researching, doing an activity or a project where you're sort of conducting research. I would imagine you're doing some teaching. Was it pretty much 9 to 5, working in an office, book-filled rooms, lots of writing by pen. Like, how was it? And
It was varied depending on which job I actually had. So when I was working for the adult education department, some of that was working in the department, but I had a community brief. So a lot of it was actually out there running courses with different community groups.
mm-hmm.
So that was not stuck in some ivory tower. When I was working in Bradford, that was much more of a traditional role. But I think the main difference between then and now is that working conditions were better then. On the whole, you had more security of employment. It's now switched much more to particularly at junior level, still almost on a gig economy, being employed, in short-term contracts and so on. So for me, in the end, I think though I can do academic stuff, my interest is much more in being, if you like, in being out there and engaging with the world.
Yeah, and it's a people subject. I mean, you're studying sort of the mind and the mind in the world, I suppose.
Yeah.
So, and you need people for that. You can't just write about yourself the whole time. Like, I think this, and this is how I think, and this is what I'm doing.
Well, the interesting thing was when is if you begin thinking about the if you like, a psychologist or a therapist and a client, then if you're just seeing it as this one particular person who's depressed coming to see a therapist. But if you then say, well, look, in that small neighborhood, there are 10 people who are all coming to see a therapist or a similar therapist. So therefore it tells you that it's not simply one person, but there are other factors which are happening within that group of people which are affecting it. And then if you begin moving out a bit further, and then you were saying, hold on a sec, there are all these pharmaceutical companies making huge amounts of money for it. And then so what you begin doing is understanding the wider system and how the different parts of the system are all impinging, if you like, on that one relationship that's going on between the therapist and the person on the other side on the other chair. So a large part of my life has been looking for ways, if you like, of exploring that particular dynamic.
I mean, it's strange that you kind of fell into it to a degree, but then, I mean, you obviously stayed within it. And when you found it as a subject, was it like a whole world opening up for you? Was it something you were aware of beforehand, or did you just kind of like, oh, I'll start doing this. This looks interesting, and then just like fell down the rabbit hole, as it were?
Can I come at that from a tangent?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
When I grew up in Australia and went to an all boys school, Australia in the 1950s was racist, sexist, homophobic, and at that time, Aborigines were seen down at the sort of, if you like, the bottom end of
the racial hierarchy of imagined evolution.
That's a good way. And in fact, when I was at school, Australian history started when Captain Cook arrived. 40,000 years of Aboriginal history at that time just didn't exist. And a few years later, I was working for this foundation in Holland, and it was doing preschool educational projects around the world. And one of the projects that it was working on was supporting Aboriginal education. So I was sent out to Australia to look at this particular project, and so that was immersing myself suddenly in Aboriginal communities. And so it was beginning to understand what the world looked like. And so I'd go to I remember being in one community and I'd say, there aren't any young women here. And they say, no, because the white people come out from town on a Saturday night drunken looking for us. And 2 points in the trip. One time I had my own plane, which flew me out to this isolated settlement in the centre of Australia. And it was a mission settlement. And the missionaries lived up on a house on a hill. And the Aboriginal community were living in barrack huts, overturned cars down the bottom, like a couple of hundred Yarns Malone. And we had this beautiful church service out in the middle of the Australian desert, which on one hand was this beautiful thing. And then they rigged up a truck battery, and it was about, and showed this film, and it was about the dangers of rich Pharisees not getting into the kingdom of heaven, something like that. And you just suddenly felt you were in this time warp. You were, this was 1970 or something. And you felt like it was, you were suddenly transported. And so that for me was this amazing awakening of racism.
Mm.
And I got it by being on the other side and being with them and then looking at the world from their point of view. And that particular bit of work finished when one of the things I'd been set up to do was to arrange a conference about Aboriginal education.
Mm.
And when I got there, I found they hadn't invited any Aborigines to this conference.
Yeah, because of course, why would you? We'll talk about you, not to you. Yeah.
So I invited some. My boss flew out. And my boss at that time was basically, because representing this foundation, was just concerned with the image. A picture of him next to a Minister of Education. That's all. And in the end of the highlights of that particular conference and the end of that career came when an Australian academic or Minister of Education, I can't remember, was talking. And this wonderful Aboriginal woman got up and said, "White man, every time you open your mouth, you tell lies," which changed the whole tenor. And you suddenly realize that these people weren't used talking about the subject matter with the people that they were talking about.
Mm. Yeah, used to making all the decisions based on an image that they had in their head rather than actually people in the room who are like, "Oh, I'm a person, I have an opinion."
Yeah, and you're talking about me and about my life.
And my destiny, my options, my my opportunities. Yeah. So I won't go too far down that rabbit hole because that's a whole thing. So yeah, sort of. Well, let's move into kind of how you ended up becoming a dramatist. Like, how was that just a natural progression? Was it kind of like you'd done sort of role plays within sessions working with people and then it sort of like expanded out from there, or how did that come about?
Well, when I was running this psychiatry day center, I went and found this amazing guy called Ken Sprague, who was an artist, community activist, great storyteller, who had been trained in this thing called socio-drama, and which is something. There was a guy called Moreno, who was a contemporary of Freud, and invented a thing called psychodrama, which was, if you like, people doing individual therapy within a group context. And socio-drama ran alongside it, where the focus was not on the individual, but the focus was on the group and the group story. And so as I was talking earlier, my interest was very much about how you expanded the one-to-one situation to understand it within a wider context. And socio-drama was a wonderful tool for doing that. Socio-drama is taking a subject and exploring it in action in the simplest way. So you're continually inventing stories, creating roles for people, looking at it from different viewpoints. So if I give an example, doing workshops about global warming at the moment, and did one on Zoom in Turkey recently. What we did was enable people to take a variety of different roles. So including, you could be a melting glacier on one thing, you could be an polar bear being affected by it, you could be a fossil fuel chief executive, you could be an XR activist. And then people would work together exploring those roles, and then we put them into a side room with the role they wanted to explore further. And they were at COP27 talking about it. So, and it's that thing, if you just talk at people, people gain a little bit. If you talk at people, if you show people, but if you engage people in some way, there's more learning. So the more people are actively involved, exactly, socio-drama becomes a way of actually, if you like, hitting more points in somebody's life. And so, so that's the sort of thing that socio-drama does. So then, as I grew older, that- I set up two community groups in Leeds. Well, one in Huddersfield, which was a group that was called Don't Act Your Age,
Oh yeah, I've heard of them. Yeah,
based in the Lawrence Batley Theatre
yeah.
for a bit, and then one in Leeds, which we did at 7. So the one in Huddersfield was a performing group. We went out and created community shows and went to community luncheons. We worked with social services and things and did things about old age and so on. And the one in Leeds was much more doing improvisation.
Mm-hmm.
The COVID, when COVID struck, that basically ended the one in Huddersfield, and the one in Leeds split. So half the group didn't want to go onto Zoom, half the group did want to go onto Zoom. So that continues now. If anybody's ever interested, wants to come along and be part of an improvisation drama group, please meet on Tuesday mornings. Please get in contact. And so that's been functioning for 11 or 12 years now. So it's a really ongoing, long group. The one interestingly happened to the one in Huddersfield is that we'd done some work on dementia. And then a group in Huddersfield from the South Asian community wanted to do some work aimed at the South Asian community about dementia, because it's not a topic which is openly talked about very often. They wanted sort of like an educational drama. Because of the original work I'd done, I got approached to see if I would help set up the group. So, I mean, the group themselves then did the organising, and then we worked together to create a play about dementia. So, but what was interesting, these were non-actors who were the majority of them were consultants in the NHS, giving up their free time, come together and perform. And so that group has been through changes. It got decimated a bit by some of the consequences of Brexit, but but at the moment we're doing a play about the long-term effects of living with COVID. So we have a play that we're taking around now, exploring, and we works in English and Urdu and Punjabi, and we're doing that primarily in the Kirklees area, because that's where the particular funding for this play is coming from at the moment.
Yeah, I was going to ask you sort of, so did you basically, when you said you kind of left academia, did you basically go freelance? Like, have you managed to keep some sort of institutional support so that's allowed you to do your work, or did you just basically set up for yourself and learn how to apply for funding and, get
different things? The first time I went freelance came from when I was working for the second time for the extramural department at the university, and so my hours got reduced, and then I started doing freelance. So for a brief period of time, I had a security net, and then I went, and then that was just like any freelancer does. You go out and you find your gigs, or you find your bits of work, and then you have your reputation being out there, and so you get passed from one.
Yeah, the work comes to you then.
It comes to you as much as possible. So that happened there. The socio-drama stuff was very similar. And again, you developed a reputation, and people invited you to come and do the work. The present, I work with a group which is called ISCAN, which is the International Socio-Drama and Creative Action Methods Network, which came together at the beginning of COVID. So we all became familiar with working on Zoom. And so it included people from America, Holland, Romania, somebody who works in China and Australia, as well as people in England. So it's quite an international group. And then worked partly as a support group and also as a performing group, so partly on Zoom and sometimes live, where people are running workshops on things like aging, anti-racism, global warming, and so on.
Mm.
And so we support each other in doing that, in that sort of work.
Mm. Are you producing, like, do you produce scripts from this? Is there a writer, or is it all just like workshopped and then people just remember, their bit?
But again, it varies. So all the plays, all, if you like, the actual community theatre stuff that I do, including the Asian theatre company, what we do is we plot out the scenes, but we don't actually have a detailed script for people to learn. So people are free to improvise. So no two performances are quite the same as such. And some of those basic scripts we put together in a book, which we published. The socio-drama stuff, it all just happens. And what's difficult in the modern day is about recording stuff and then showing it is all the data protection procedures that you now have to go through, and that you have to get everybody's, everybody
Sign off and permission.
and all of that stuff. So that means that there's quite a bit of stuff that's on the internet about social and stuff that I've done or been interviewed about. But a lot of that was sort of, if you like, when data protection wasn't as stringent as it is now. So it's much more difficult now to actually do one that other people can actually watch.
Yeah, and it's a strange situation as well because you're creating drama, but you're also workshopping stuff. So it's a process of discovery for people, and that can be quite personal. It's not necessarily theatre in the I'm on stage, look at me, I'm telling you a story. Sometimes it's like a personal discovery.
Well, which is what you want. So if you're working on climate change, you want people to come to get some understanding about either this is something that I can do, this is something how I come to terms with it, or these are actions I can take. So the last stage of any socio-drama is sharing, so that people have an opportunity to both talk about the different roles they've played, but also how that's touched, if you like, on different parts of their personal life, or what they want to do about the learning from that. So you don't leave people, if you like, abandoned at the end, but there is a space to hold people before they go.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like really interesting work. It sounds like something I'd get a lot out of that. So I can imagine, it's good for keeping you interested.
I'll send you details of future workshops.
So I'm going to move into some of the sort of standard questions now, because I think, sort of more stuff will come up as we go through it. So I'll start off with COVID. So this question's changing a little bit because it seems, I think we're starting to reach the point where people are kind of forgetting, or, we've moved on enough. So just sort of take us through your memories of going into lockdown, sort of at what point you locked down, whether it was before the official lockdown or whether you didn't lock down at all. And I also want to look at sort of the volume of work you were doing at the time. Did it mean that your work stopped and you were kind of like, what am I going to do? Or you were like busy as hell going, I have to arrange everything around this and I have to make sure everyone knows what's going on? And what do you think have been the kind of long-term changes for you, if there have been any from COVID? Has it changed your work at all?
Okay. I think personally, because when COVID came, we were both, my partner and I were both in our 70s, we were fairly cautious.
Yeah.
And had been. But in terms of people we know, we almost feel like this minority now who haven't had COVID because it's so prevalent and so much around. So personally, I think, as you were saying, we haven't been as cautious as some people, but we've been fairly cautious in terms of wearing masks, social distancing. I mean, I can remember the days when when it was on and we were walking around the edges of Roundhope Park to make sure we didn't bump. You were walking across the other side of the road to maximize social distance. So we did all of that stuff, and we got more through, and we've got food delivered to minimize going to supermarkets for a while. So we did all of that stuff. Work-wise, interestingly, it's been brilliant because I was doing a lot of traveling, and I got tired of traveling And so all the glamour of flying around and being in hotels and strange places, now it's
Not that glamorous, really.
it lost all of its glamour. And so when COVID came and everything switched online, and I just had to walk downstairs into my office, it was, so instead of having to get up, travel, go to an airport, where to go, so for me, COVID was a fresh breath of life in what I was able to do, particularly. So you lost something by not having personal contact with people.
Yeah.
But what you gained from was that you could work with people anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
If it take time changes. So that's balanced. So personally speaking, that's balanced out very well. In terms of some of my work, as I said, COVID decimated it just because the Huddersfield group was very old. It was quite old anyway. So that basically brought an end to that group. It split in half the group in the one I was doing at 7 in Leeds, but it enabled half the group to continue and still to meet at present. It affected the Asian theatre company because it brought, I think, because of Brexit difficulties, two people emigrated, consultants emigrated to Canada. Another one, I think, just the pressures of working in the NHS and during Brexit emigrated to Australia. So my personal experience was the NHS lost 3 highly skilled, competent people, primarily as a consequence of both Brexit and COVID.
So we'll go to that last lockdown. You remember the last lockdown, the one that went on forever through winter, and it was just dark and it just wouldn't end. So it was like,
sounds like you didn't have a particularly good time doing it.
It was fine while it was sunny. It was just like when it was that sort of January, February, and it just went on forever. And you were just like, oh, when are we going out? Well, it wasn't even just the when are we going outside? It was also because it was dark and cold. You didn't particularly want to go outside, but you were just sort of locked in. So what I'm getting at, I suppose, is did the lockdown become hard or irritating at any point for you? Like, are you quite happy to sort of remain in that? Like, did the lockdown bring for you just sort of staying in the house and being in the house more? Has it made that change, or do you kind of?
I think we were in a social we were in one of the social bubbles with one of our families who lived close by, and we did a lot of grandparenting. So I think the grandparenting was something. Well, in addition to being able to continue one's work, which I could do, the grandparenting,
gave you that social interaction and
and a lot of joy.
Yeah,
a lot of joy from doing it. So I think it wasn't as difficult a time for us as it has been for other people. What's interesting is that we're now doing this play about long COVID, bringing and talking about. So and so the play that we're doing is set in a GP surgery, and so you have different people coming in with different effects. And say you've got somebody coming in with long COVID, but who lost their partner, their husband, to COVID, and they weren't able to be with them when they died because they weren't allowed into hospital. Year on, they're still grieving that. In the play, we have an anti-vaxxer, so we deal with that and the consequences that still has. That even in the present stage where there's a vulnerable person in the household and somebody doesn't want to get vaccinated, how do you deal with that? Another one, we've got a young person with anorexia because of the effects of long COVID on children's mental health in particular, which has been huge. And so we're dealing with that. Another scene is about a factory worker who, because they've got long COVID, is scared about losing their job. And then we can build into that all the present stuff about dual poverty and so on. So it's very current and sort of up to date. So even though there's bits of long COVID I haven't necessarily experience personally, because I know enough people around who had a variety of experiences, and particularly the people in the Asian community who are actors in the play bring their own experiences into it, including actually one of the people who's actually a GP in real life. So in a sense, I'm really much aware of, that COVID isn't finished.
Yeah.
And even though the government wants us to pretend that it's actually finished, whatever there are 2 million people who are suffering the effects of long COVID at the moment, and who knows what the when the next strain's going to come and so on. So, but again, so the present bit for me is still around sort of inconsistencies of protection in terms of, if I catch the train to London, do I work, am I masked, am I masked? If I go to a supermarket, do I mask it? And sometimes I find I mask and I'm the only person left in the whole supermarket.
You're still seeing people doing it though.
It's pretty rare now. And so there's that. So there's still all of those sort of personal decisions that are around. And so until quite recently, if we were doing social stuff with friends, we'd test in the morning, they'd test in the morning, and we did all of that. We don't, unless somebody, so at the moment, the people I know, you only test if you have symptoms. You don't test anymore just because it's a social account, just because you're meeting up socially. So there's still, if you like, not so much as a daily thing, but but COVID is never far away from one's thinking and consciousness.
Yeah. I mean, that's why it's still in its question. I mean, so obviously, as I started this, I mean, COVID was factually a thing, but as far as I was concerned, was not a thing. And then we went into lockdown and it was kind of, oh, okay. So I knew we had to kind of speak about it at the time, but as well, I'm like, I still think I'll be talking about this. If we're all here at the end of the decade, I still think I'll be talking about this then.
I think that's a good debatable point, about whether we'll still be here at the end of the decade.
I don't fancy our chances at the moment.
No.
So we'll do Brexit next. I mean, I'm glad that you brought up long COVID as well, because that is one that's, it's kind of invisible it's invisible in the broader discussion and discourse, but it's something that, I mean, I see it, I see I'm working at a place temping at the moment, and I see people who are sort of off long-term sick. I know of other people who have been off long-term sick, and there is the kind of, oh, you're just making a fuss, get over it kind of element, because it's that whole thing of like, diminishing it, like they did with COVID, of like, it's just the flu and stuff. It's like, it's not just the flu. It's a flu that's really horrible and kills way more people and is way more virulent and contagious and so on. But yeah, you don't hear much discussion of long COVID at all. It's still sort of, I think it seems to have it reminds me of how the media would talk about Iraq War syndrome, for example, of like, oh, all these people are moaning about this thing, it's completely made up. That seems to be the attitude. Okay, so we'll do Brexit.
Right.
So you've mentioned it already. Basically, the question around Brexit is, did it affect your work at all? Like, was there any kind of noticeable difference for you? Was it good, bad, or didn't notice it? Or even, was it too tied up with COVID to notice?
I think it affects my work when you're working internationally, because what you have is you have international people, people in other countries, continents talking to you about Brexit as such. And occasionally, depending what the topic, if you're doing a socio-drama event, then an element of Brexit might come into it. And I think probably if I was still traveling more face to face, then Brexit might affect my work. But I don't import, export, or anything else like that. It affects my work in terms. It doesn't affect me so much about my work. It affects me as you grow older, for example, and you think about social care. And then you're aware that one of the consequences of Brexit is that we don't have people, is there no longer people working in social care.
Mm.
So I was a board member for a long time of the Leeds Jewish Welfare Board. If I'd still been in that position now, then Brexit would be a huge thing, because you'd be thinking about the shortage of staff. But personally, if you're, because I'm 80 years old now, and you have to begin thinking about what's going to happen to you in later life, then you immediately think Brexit has a huge implication in terms. And you're aware of the indirect thing, like if you go out to eat somewhere now, restaurants will tell you about difficulties of getting staff, closing staff. You're aware about food being picked. And then you're aware about the idiocies of, you have on one hand all of these people, refugees, asylum seekers in this country, and they're being told you're not allowed to work. Part of your condition about being here. And then on the other hand, you have all of these work shortages, employment shortages, and you say, I am. And so it's kind of where if you like, the thinking about Brexit in political terms has created silo of things. Where you can't make sense, if you like, you can't make sensible decisions because it runs against prevailing political orthodoxy. But more personally, other than I lost a couple of people in one of my theatre groups directly because of Brexit and its restrictions on people being able to come and go from this country. But again, with teenage grandchildren, and then you're aware of, if they want, the limitations that Brexit might well pose about if you want to travel around and work freely in Europe.
Your study.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will move on. We won't dwell on Brexit too long. So you've touched on this already, but so within your work, the question is normally like, what can you do within your work to adapt, mitigate, or raise awareness around climate change? Obviously, you've mentioned some of that already, but I mean, is that something, well, I get the impression it is something that's sort of large in your consciousness and in your work. But yeah, if you just want to talk about that for a while.
Okay. I suppose there's a whole bit about the different angles to it. So we were talking about it when we were out with friends at dinner and afternoon tea yesterday. Yeah. So I have to backtrack a bit. The part of the whole neoliberal stuff is that actually you minimize the state, and what you do is you individualize problems. So a very good example is the water situation at the moment. The main problem is the fact that about privatization and the fact that the water companies, you lose 2 trillion liters of water every year and haven't built any reservoirs.
And they're dumping all the sewage.
And dump all the sewage. But actually, they now make it our problem. So what we have to do is limit the amount of showers we take. Right. So it becomes, or we're not allowed to water in the garden. So what you do is you individualize the problem. Okay. And that's been a common tactic through the tobacco stuff and things. So what doesn't happen in the present system is that the villains are never the big companies. Right. And even if like on
and the solution's never political. Like there's every bloody article you see on it will be what you need to do, and this might happen or this could happen. It's like, it will happen, and it is happening faster, and I can't do anything about that. Like me, going vegan and not flying is not going to stop people dumping sewage in the water. It's not going to stop people dumping smoke in the sky, kind of thing.
So that leads nicely on to thinking about global warming. The thing about global warming is, again, this individualization. So it's up to you about a bit of plastic. It's up to you about whether you fly or not, or what you do about your car, things like that. But actually, the big issue is fossil fuel manufacturers. will stop. And
Yeah, it's not plastic bags. It's stop fossil fuels now, like now.
I mean,
It's been that for 40 years.
The fossil fuel companies knew about the consequences of their actions 40 years ago, what it would actually lead to, and had a disinformation policy ever since. So it doesn't mean to say that doing something about plastic isn't worthwhile, but it actually won't stop the bigger problem.
It won't stop plastic being made.
On one hand, so what we have, there's the big issues of fossil fuel start, deforestation, the whole, environment,
Topsoil loss,
all of that stuff.
ocean acidification.
Yeah. So in essence, they are things that the governments need to do, or that at one level, and say, stop. We still subsidize fossil fuel companies, for millions of pounds. And one of the risks in the present economic crisis, of course, is that people will say, oh, in the short term, we have to, in order to ease the crisis, we now have to
make it work.
Get some coal mines again.
Yeah.
From purely climate change point of view, the war in Ukraine is just manufacturing weapons, or the destruction of buildings and things like that. Anyway, so then the question comes. So there becomes two separate things, which is, well, how do you live with that knowledge of the fact that the chances of us being able to stick to 1.5%, 1.5 degrees is pretty minimal. Most scientists now say that, we're
going to go past it in the next couple of years, if not months.
Yeah. Okay. So, but that's a really difficult thing for people to live with.
But they have to get over it because, you're going to have to deal with it. It's reality. You have to deal with it.
Yes and no. Yes and no. Because, how do you live with, because at one level, it's the situation is so depressing. The easiest thing to do is to ignore it. Right. And pretend it's not.
But then it gets worse.
But
you don't have to think about it.
You don't have to think about it. And the interesting thing is, if you're sort of doing this socio-dramatically, and you have somebody playing the role of nature, the voice of nature is saying, how many bloody warnings do I have to give you? Look at the fires I'm giving you. Look at the droughts I'm giving you. Look at the global warming I'm giving you. As a race, what is it about you as humans that you can't understand destruction? And at one level, nature's sort of saying, look, in the long term, it doesn't worry us. The planet, whatever you do to it, eventually,
I'll shake you up. Yeah.
We've got billions of more years of life. We'll be okay. Look at you. Look at what you're doing. So one interesting bit is, how do you actually engage almost at the personal level about what's going on for people? And if people, and so there's quite a lot of work around how do you help people, if you like, come to terms with that, cope with the feelings about that. That's one side. The other side of it then is, okay, if this is so bad, what can you actually do about it? Which is a more difficult bit, because if you actually do quite a lot of reading about it, what you have is brilliant, lots of analyses. So there's quite a lot of things about what the future could be like. We don't have to have any more we can manufacture meat in the laboratories now. We don't have to destroy rainforests and use up all of this land for cattle and methane gases and things like that. We don't have to do that anymore. So there are lots of solutions, like that, which also says you could lead a carbon neutral life, But it's always, how do you get there? You can see what the future's like.
How do you get people who own that market to give that market up?
Exactly. Because we live within a capitalist system driven by short-term interests. So if you're a company, it's very, because of the way it's structured. What you're doing is looking to the dividend that you can give to your shareholders, and so it's very difficult to say you're not going to get any handout for the next 5 years because we're going to give all of our profits, that we make, we're going to reinvest in the new Green Deal.
Mm.
Then what would happen is people would take their money away from that and invest it somewhere else.
Mm.
So so at some of those things, what's necessary is to find an effective way of dealing at that mega level, because it's only, if you like, it's only significant change which can actually save us.
Yeah, which will make an impact. Yeah. Because anything else is just, it's not even touching the sides, is it?
Yeah. What it does in this individualization is makes you feel better because you're doing something.
But it's just busy work, though, isn't it? It's that sort of, it's kind of, yeah. And it's kind of like for the boss of like, oh, you can't read at work, like look busy and look professional and stuff. So like, what difference does it make? There's no customers in, like, if a customer comes in, I'll serve them. So sort of day to day for you, I mean, obviously you were flying, you're not flying so much. You've got you can do more work on Zoom. You're doing active work around it. You're raising awareness and so on. Yeah. I mean, ultimately it's got to be change that comes from the top, because how much more can you change really in your work apart from like if you just dedicated all of your work to climate change awareness? I think that's the only other thing that you could really do.
Yeah. And I have grandchildren who say, who are saying, oh, it's your generation which has destroyed our world.
Well, it's several generations.
Yeah, exactly. So, you think, we did. Yeah. Have to hold your hands up. And I mean,
Well, I've said,
sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, I've said before, like with my parents, like I know growing up in the 80s, like I know that I encouraged my parents, especially my mum, to like throw more stuff away. Like it was like, don't keep that, like obviously people who've grown up with rationing and like post-war and stuff, you have this kind of, you got to keep things and make most of them and use them and reuse them kind of thing. So all of that disposability and single use stuff, I mean, that it was happening before, probably from the 60s onwards, you were getting more and more of it. But the real thing, like for me, was the 80s where you was just like, throw it away, get a new one. It's all plastic, just, because how many, like the amount of digital watches I bought, they were the mobile phones of their day. Like everyone had a new fancy digital watch and with calculators or whatever on. And you would go through watches, that's a lot of disposability. That's, there's electronics in there. You're already beginning that sort of pile of electrical waste journey. So yeah, like we're all culpable.
Yeah.
What were you going to say? Can you remember?
No.
Right, sorry.
Well, no, that's okay. One of the things as you grow older, what you lose is, if you like, that parking spot in your brain where you can hold a thought and bring it out a minute or so later. It just that bit of the short-term memory that actually just goes.
I'm so screwed then. I'm no good at that.
Enjoy it while you have it, is what I could say.
Okay, so talking of short-term memory destruction, let's move on to social media. So my question on social media is because more and more people are kind of doing it, and obviously I've had to do more of it with this project, and it takes up a lot of time, and I don't always see the benefit from spending that time on there. I also notice when I haven't spent the time. But for yourself, like how much of your time do you spend working via social media? And is that time that you spend on it, is that well spent? Do you see a good return on that time?
I'm not on anything. I'm on WhatsApp work groups. The only way I'm on Facebook is when my Huddersfield group used to, we were on Facebook for advertising, but because all the groups disappeared, we can't find a way to get off that bit of Facebook, which I'd be quite happy to do. But they keep saying, in order to access your account, you need a password. As we don't have any contact any longer with anybody who's got a password. But I don't, I just admit, you have 34 searches. I just immediately delete. I don't bother looking at them. So no, I'm on LinkedIn, but again, I don't actively use it. It's more people look on it and somebody will say, will you accept my invite? And occasionally, if it looks relevant, I'll click on it. But generally, but I don't use it actively. So now my partner's uses Facebook, and so occasionally she'll show me something interesting on Facebook. But no, I don't use Facebook. I don't feel any great sort of loss from not being on any of it.
I mean, you've already got a full career behind you. You've already made contacts and built networks, and people are aware of you and what you're doing.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not like you need to sort of reach more and more people. I mean, I suppose for you, it might be useful from a funding perspective if you wanted to be like, oh, this is the work that we've been working on.
Yeah.
But
yeah. I mean, I understand its role. I understand its role. I mean, I was involved in doing community work in South Yorkshire sometime years ago. I was saying, what you need to do is you need to get social media techie school kids to work with old age, pair them up with old age pensioners and help bring them online, so that then they could access people wherever. So I mean, I fully see it. I fully see its benefits, but it's, and going off on another tangent, it's kind of like, it doesn't relate still properly to the education system. So people are still, we live in a rapidly changing world, but people are still being asked to memorize sort of dates of the Tudors or Henry, things that you just click on Google and you think there's no point in having to learn this stuff. What you're looking at is you want to have people who are social media savvy, but who are creative, spontaneous, who can do teamwork online and face to face. These are the sorts of skills, but sort of like Michael Gove, push education largely back to the dark ages in the sense. Most education teaches children to the world that's been lost rather than to the world that's coming.
Yeah, and
that was particularly interestingly, that was very much true working in China, where so much of their educational system is very rote learning. There's a teacher at the front tells you things, you raise your hands. And when I was teaching stuff about socio-drama there, you do one session and they'd say, well, we know that now. And you say, no, it's theoretical, but socio-drama is about learning to do it in practice. So it's that sense of being spontaneous and creative that they found much more difficult to actually work with because it went against this whole... Anyway, go on. What were you going to say?
Can't remember.
Come on, you can't have that excuse.
What are we on social media? No, I mean, I suppose I want to kind of bring it all round back to kind of you mentioning that work on the drugs in schools and sort of the work stuff, like that idea of climate change being our addiction to oil, our addiction to capitalism and treats and consumption and so on. I suppose I wanted to look at kind of addiction and concentration a little bit, just sort of get your thoughts on that. Like what's the question? There is a question there that I want to get to, but you've got the gist of what I'm trying to get towards. But like, how these things link up. I mean, you know, because you get all this stuff about ADHD, and then there's a lot of people sort of want to blame the internet and tabs and like lack of concentration and flashing lights, and then you've got all the lack of sleep stuff, and you know, and then people getting anxious, and then because they're getting anxious, they latch onto something that they connect to that gives them the comfort and the security, and then they're like, you know, whether it's food or drugs or shopping or whatever, you know, and then get kind of too absorbed with that. I mean, we've obviously talked about it, but I don't know.
I think, well, I, at one level, we live in a world which is rapidly changing. So it is, I'm worrying. You know, so not only is it changing, you know, but in a sense, it's looking, particularly at the moment, it's looking much bleaker. So I mean, you could go back, and one of the things that people do at a time of difficulties, you go back to ways that you know. If you can. I mean, there's a lot of people, what you lose in the present world is your normal means of looking after yourself, whether it's fuel poverty, whether it's children with social contact at school, which was disrupted by COVID. One thing that leads to is mental health problems, and so
Stress and trauma, and
the heightened anxiety. So sometimes that becomes serious. And so sometimes that will take the form, like, as we talked about before, of things like in children and eating disorders, which have grown enormously, or it can lead to. I think one of the other things that's around at the moment, there's a lot of anger around. Generally, people are frustrated, angry. And so some of that is open to all the conspiracy theory stuff. I want a scapegoat and
an explanation.
For it. It was interesting. We had one of our theatre performances with the Asian Theatre Company. We got invaded by anti-vaxxers.
In the play, or that
at the end of the day, really quite frightening. There were children in the audience, and they were very aggressive. And so I think there's a certain amount of anger which lashes out on any sort of on authority around. But then some of it is fueled. I think at the moment, the Tory government, and particularly Truss, wants to be the reincarnation of Margaret Thatcher. Is quite happy to have her full, instead of taking on the miners, will take on all the unions which are presently out there protesting about their working and living conditions. So in some senses, people have to find individual solutions, whether it's that often in terms of pressure under stress, you can be angrily outward, or you can take it on board inwardly, where you get depression, or things like that. And addiction then becomes something, it's a different form of self-harming. Now, addiction is a form of self-harm of one level, but it's if you like, you're absorbing in some way the anxiety provoking world that we all live in.
Yeah, it's a sort of escape from pain into peace, and something reliable, something that's, here's my rock, I hold on to it. It's always there for me. Yeah. I mean, mentioning trust there, I get this feeling that it's that sort of when you go on Amazon and they try to sell you the pen you've just bought, it's that like they have got no other ideas. It's just people bought this before, I'm going to sell you it again. That's the real impression that I get, because there literally is no substance there. Like, and there hasn't been any substance for a good while. It's just like, here's a press release about a thing that's fixed the problem because I talked about it. And it doesn't seem like action happens, or they'll talk about something, they'll stand in front of a burning building going, this building's not on fire. It's like, I can literally see it with my eyes. I feel like there's this superficial kind of just do the actions, just go through the motions, just sell them what they've bought before. That's the impression that I get with a lot of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so it leads on to, I'll come back to that, it leads on to a slightly different question, which is that you now have companies like Meta, with lunch, Facebook, Google, things like that, who are now bigger than nation state, most nation states. And so it's almost, if you begin thinking about it in the broader sense, you're beginning to build a world structure which is very anti-democratic, because on one hand you have the populists here, and it's interesting that a lot of the things that the Tories were doing about tackling bits of democracy, whether it's limiting the rights to protest, whether it's proroguing Parliament, whether it's now attacking the judges, if we were looking at them in similar things are happening in somewhere like Hungary, we get horrified. But there's something about that if they're happening on your own doorstep, there's nobody calling them out sufficient.
But there wouldn't be any fascism on the BBC. It's like, well, yeah, there might be.
But it's almost like the BBC you now get these presenters leaving the BBC because it's so difficult because of the BBC's need for balance. Yeah. And you could see that for a long time on climate change, where even though the evidence was clearly that climate change was happening, the BBC still felt the need to have a counter person there when somebody was talking about them.
Yeah, but they they don't have that many flat earthers on. I'm sure they'll get round to it as it becomes more popular online, and they need to.
But you don't have, but also you don't have many trade unionists on. So if you think about working class, if you think back to the days when we had people like Jack Job and then dominant people, you rarely get a working class somebody other than at a time of strike. You get Mike McLean, she's doing a great job at the moment talking about it. But in terms of general discourse outside of the present time, so it's almost like the people have to take this action in order to get their viewpoint heard. Because otherwise, in the general course of things, it's educated commentators talking to each other.
And trying to impress their housemasters. Like they're not they are literally just having conversations with themselves and nobody else. Is like a total disconnect. Well, that was a good tangent.
Yeah.
So that was out of social media. Let's do universal basic income. So I think this will be quite interesting. So obviously you kind of will need to be slightly retroactive with this, but the question is normally, if there was a universal basic income, so you're getting your basic needs met month to month, would you still work? If you would still work, would you still be doing the job that you do now? And if you would still be doing the job that you do now, how do you think that would be changed?
I like the idea of the universal basic income that everybody has. And I know it's been tried out in a small way. I don't know as much about it as I would like to know. In terms of it, this is really a question. I'm lucky, and I see myself as being very fortunate that I do work I enjoy doing. Some of the stuff I do, sometimes you're in a position you could charge a lot of money, but a lot of the time, particularly now, I do it because I enjoy doing it rather than for any monetary concerns. And I'm at the age where nearly everybody else I know in my age group doesn't work anymore. But I still work. I enjoy it. Gives me satisfaction, and it seems to be, and other people find it useful, which is the main thing. So personally, I don't think it would affect me. I think it obviously, the question comes around much more about people who are living a gig economy life at the moment, who are struggling to do and often dead end jobs, which give minimal personal satisfaction.
Yeah, it's access to credit as well. Like the discussion always turns to, people aren't getting paid enough money. Like for me, the problems are like what we need to do. We need to put money in people's pockets and we need to put power in their hands. I don't think concentrating it upwards towards the top helps anything. We've been doing that for 30 years, not made any improvements. It's a loss. You have to write it off. But I think that what they often miss with this conversation is the access to credit. Like one of the key fundamentals of neoliberalism was we're going to stop people paying, we're going to stop paying higher and higher wages, and we're going to make everyone buy everything on credit. We're going to make credit cheaper and more readily available. Well, you can't get no credit if you haven't got a regular job or a regular way to pay back. Okay, we've done a bit of that as well with like ninja loans and stuff during the subprime, but ultimately it's not a working path. And if people can't get the access to the credit to buy the bigger ticket items, all you're ever going to do is be chipping away at savings. And I think that's always, that seems to be always missed, that it's just, people aren't using their money in the right way, or they need more work, or they need more jobs or more hours, or it's like pay people more, but also give them a way to get access to money, to credit.
I mean, in a limited way, credit unions do do that. That part of their purpose. So there was a guy somewhere in Lancashire who set up a People's Bank. And again, it was an interesting story for a month or so, and then he just disappeared. So, and then the guy who set up the work in, I think, Bangladesh, who set up
the micro loans.
Yeah, exactly. So there are other models for actually doing that.
So I'm going to do this question with you before I go into my sort of final question. So when I talk about unions, I don't have a specific question on it. I think the one that I'm genuinely leaning towards is sort of what your experience of unions has been. Obviously, a lot of your work, it's a professional field. It would be more professional alliance.
Now, I was in the old days, I was an algo shop steward and convener for a bit. So I'd been in the union world. So I think 2 or 3 different points. So I think it's sad the trade unions have been so decimated over the last few years, which has led to inequalities in wealth just increase enormously. So that to those that have, shall more be given, which is the way the world works at the moment. So I think that's really sad. So I think trade unions have an important role to play. I think that at a different level, I think I haven't been to one recently, but my experience of trade union branch meetings was that they weren't particularly creative, interesting affairs. So at one time, what I wanted to do was, I read somewhere that in Latin America, which is a lot more interesting social drama sort of work, trade union movement had set up a drama group so that you could take an issue like low pay or something else like that, but instead of somebody standing up and doing the speech and somebody else having to second there to all the very formalistic thing, it'd be more lively as a way of opening up discussion and having different viewpoints. So using contacts I had, I wanted to see if I could find any appetite for doing that here, and there wasn't. Well, I mean, in the limited context that I had and tried, there just was no appetite. And I did the same thing with Labour Party branches. Then people I knew, and so that when we talk about the need to change, it's sometimes the difficulty is it's rooted back in these historical. This is the way this is the way we've always done it.
Yeah. Don't you be coming in here and changing things. Yeah. We've always done it this way.
And you feel that in some of the democratic structures, are quite rigid. I've got nothing against the trade union movement other than I think concern the way it's been marginalized, which has stopped the working class have a more significant voice. And I think that it could look for ways of enlivening as can the Labour Party, about how it conducts itself. I mean, my experience, I mean, I used to be a member of the Labour Party, but I remember once about, again, many years ago, there was an evening. Now, I could either go to a community group or a Labour Party. My experience of the Labour Party at that time was you sat around, you talked, you passed fairly meaningless motions, which sort of went up to the next level and so on. And you were cannon fodder, where you were expected to go out at election time and stick leaflets through people's doors. And unless you were making the Labour Party your career, it's different, where you got into all the factionalism and things like that. It wasn't a particularly happy home to be in. And it felt like going to a community action group, you could achieve a lot more, personally than by being a Labour Party branch member.
Do you think we're viewed more? Do you think some of that's kind of like left over from formal hierarchies and, like sort of remnants of the empire? And do you think that we're more, I mean, I don't even believe this as I'm saying it, like more egalitarian now? Like, I do think there has been, to a degree, there was a breaking down of barriers of like, you're not necessarily better, but that seems to have been a bit of an aberration, maybe.
Well, if we go back to some of the things that we were talking about much earlier, then I think there's obviously been huge improvements in things like about issues to do with race, issues to do with gender, issues to do with women's role. All if I think back 50 years, and things like that. I mean, there's just much more awareness of these sorts of issues, much more equality. I think that the gardeners have arrived by the sound of the Lord.
Don't worry.
So, and so much more open discussion about it all than there was 50 years, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So in that sense, I see huge, it's like socially, and I'm aware, because of Me Too movement and back days and things like that, there's huge things to go about and issues still to do with race and gender and so on. But there still seem to me to have been huge strides made over the last 50 years. But some of these are dwarfed by some of the bigger changes, like capitalist change, like global warming, which doesn't really care about some of the, it affects, that's not fair because obviously it affects poorer countries at the moment, global warming much more significantly at this stage than it does richer Western countries. So yes, global warming does have a racial and class and it affects and about women's role and so on. So okay. So I'll take that back. These things
it's really difficult, isn't it? Because it's kind of like there has been progress, but then we're in a point where it's like, oh, lots of things are getting worse.
Yes. Yeah. So I just, at the moment, I see climate change and things like this. I just see that there's forces for the good and negative forces. And I think in climate change, if we're not careful, that's one where the negative forces are out winning at the moment. Positive forces, but that's all some things like Me Too issues actually swinging the other way. So, like in terms of those which are destructive to the whole human race, then I believe it's all global warming and perhaps what used to be so much bigger in the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, the nucleus, right? It's like no one's even bothered.
Which is now just appearing around the sidelines again. Now, what might happen now?
Well, this year the heat waves in India and Pakistan that were going on, for weeks, it was above 50 degrees.
Yeah.
And this is in areas with huge, like two countries with massive populations, both nuclear armed, both hate each other. And you've got this like heating force destabilizing things. Like, that's dangerous. That's a dangerous situation. It's a dangerous situation with Putin as well. And it's kind of like, but also NATO letting all of those nuclear agreements lapse all through this century. Like, Are we not aware that these things can happen? Are we do we not think that some of these things are put in for a reason? It just boggles my mind sometimes. It's like, how do we let ourselves get to this point? Anyway, so my final question is on work and change. And yes, so if there were any three things that you could change about your role and your work, what would they be?
And of all the things that are around at the moment, I think the biggest thing would be to find a way that, and I'm trying to work in a limited way with other people to do that. I mean, to find a way which actually does something significant about climate change. I think in terms of destruction of the human race and about the world that I've helped to create for the various children and for children and grandchildren in my family. I just think it's just, and then obviously for everybody, for the whole of humanity, it's just, it's just
Terrible.
scary and scary and frightening.
Yeah.
And I think, like lots of other people, it's kind of like, what is the magic bullet which will unlock the forces in a significant way, but we will have huge worldwide systematic change, which recreates the Garden of Eden, but perhaps the Garden of Eden wasn't a particularly good model to have creates, and again, there's no problem. It's not difficult to think of what the world might possibly look like, but it's how you actually create the stepping stones to get from where we are to where we'd like it to be, and to help find a way of being part of that process.
I think personally, the way that I see it more now is I think there's two things. I think there's a massive, massive appetite for action and for things to happen. It's just we've not been allowed to see that at all. We've not been allowed to see it properly manifest itself in any way. But like every few years, you get this big outbreak of climate activism, and like people will flock to it. Like you can build a movement in seconds in like the climate sphere, and that there is a lot of work going on, like a lot of work in the academic level, in the industrial level, in like there is a lot of work and a lot of study happening and good things that are going on that isn't just greenwash. So I think there's more happening than we're presented with. I think the main problem is this media. It's the media and the mindset, and it's this re-promoting of the idea of there's no alternative. There can be no change. We're not doing anything. And like the absolute refusal to do anything. Things like getting to planes to go on these COP meetings, or people who work in environmental studies flying all the way across the world for a conference. It's like, surely we're beyond this by now. Like all of that stuff should be basic. Stop doing that stuff. I think it's there waiting to break through. And I think there's a lot of stuff going on that is good, that's already there, that's kind of underreported. I think what needs to change is the attitude, is the discourse, is the way that we talk about things. That's the sense that I get at the moment. But I think that kind of ties back to your work, especially with, the social dramatism work. When we were talking just then about, various social improvements in terms of equalities, some improvements in terms of equalities, and a lot of really good ones, to be fair, that, you've played a role in that by bringing out those stories, creating that understanding, creating that empathy. And I think, we're in a kind of process of that at the moment as well. I mean, as you sort of, I've got the answer of like, you're obviously not going to retire. You're going to work for like until you can't. I get the impression.
Yeah.
Do you see your work as having a mission, or do you just see it as like you do what you do and what comes out of it is what comes out of it, and you just want to try and?
No, I still see myself as being a small agent of social change.
Thank you again to Ron for being my guest. Thanks again to all my guests, and thanks to you, Leeds, for being my subject. And of course, most of all, thank you to you, my dear listener. Come back on Friday to hear me speak to Lydia from Compass Arts. Congratulations to Lula in Brazil. And yeah, that's it. You can follow this show on Twitter at Working Hours 3 and on Instagram at Working Hours Pod Leeds. Use the hashtag Working Hours Pod Leeds to stay up to date on when new episodes are being released, to DM me with your questions, or most importantly, to get in touch if you'd like to be my guest on this show. Please do chuck in anything you can to help the show grow. Go to ko-fi.com/working hours and join me there for £1 a month, or you can make a one-off donation of whatever amount. You can also go to patreon.com/working hours pod to support Working Hours, again from as little as £1 a month. Why not be super awesome and join both? Do something new and something different. Remember to like, share, follow and subscribe to Working Hours. That's me. Cheers ears. Take care out there and be kind to each other, Leeds. Working Hours is produced, recorded, edited and published by Simon Treen for Western Studios Leeds Limited. The music was The Bees from Chopin's Etudes, which is in the public domain and was taken from musopen.org. Please like Western Studios Leeds on Facebook at facebook.com/Western_Studios_Leeds and on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/company/Western-Studios. Leeds, are you considering taking the plunge into podcasts or audio content? Then think Western Studios for support, advice and guidance on getting it made. At Western Studios, you work with a real-life learner who is actually in Leeds. Not a piece of software, not a course of articles or a series of live chats and video courses, but me, a person in physical place-based reality. If you want to work with me to make your podcast or any digital audio content in Leeds, whether it's for your own cause, your publicity campaigns, to promote your products, increase your sales, or just to create your own passion projects, then get in touch with me, Western Studios, now. Don't wade through vapid articles and videos and podcasts about how to make podcasts by disembodied virtual people on the web. Get on with making your podcast now, and then when it gets hard and expensive and it all goes wrong, which it will, then call Western Studios to make your podcast with you or even for you. Western Studios will take on your podcast's boring, time-consuming and painful admin, recording, editing, transcription, whatever. Tell me about your podcasting pain points and I can make it all better for you. I feel your pain. For a charge, I will share it. Remember, podcast work is work. Leeds businesses, Leeds campaigns, Leeds brands. Got an inkling that you'd like a podcast but don't know where to start? Contact Western Studios at makemypodcast@western-studios.com and we'll start making your podcast straight away. The first hour of arranged consultation and pre-production time is free. £25 an hour after that for editing, recording, production. I can also arrange hefty discounts for the right project. So tell me your idea and your budget and I'll tell you what I can do for you. What do you have to lose? Time. That's what. Time is running out. The best time to make a podcast was 10 years ago. The second best time is right now. Writers in Yorkshire, what are you doing with your lives? Hopefully you're writing. Well, I know there are listeners out there who want to hear great original writing performed as audio content that is about and for and has been made in Leeds. How do I know this? Because I'm one of them loiners what wants it. Help me make your old screenplays, unpublished novels, unperformed plays, stories, poems, and performances, whatever you got, baby, and make it as podcast content. Is your work arty, salacious, pulpy, strange? Good. Is it unfinished? Good. I can help you with that too. I can work with you to find actors, musicians, and voiceover artists and quickly realize your projects. I get practice making the shows and you get a finished, performed and published version of your writing. Save yourself the hassle and the headache of making your podcasts on your own by working with me instead.